When Tadashi arrived at his grandfather's remote cabin by the lake, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. The cabin, nestled deep in the forested hills, was a humble wooden structure that creaked and groaned with age. Surrounded by towering pines and fog that hovered over the still waters of the lake, it was a place designed for quiet isolation, far from the noise of the city. Tadashi had come for a few days of fishing and solitude, hoping to clear his mind. The first day passed in quiet contentment. He gathered firewood, cleaned the dust from the old cabin, and cast his fishing line into the calm water. The silence felt like a gift, with only the faint sound of birds and the occasional splash from the lake. As evening settled, he stoked the fire in the small wood-burning stove and settled in with a cup of tea. But as the light faded, an uneasy sensation crept over him. The air grew heavier, thick with a smell that was both metallic and sour, as if something rancid lingered just outside. He brushed it off as the old cabin's mustiness. Yet the smell clung, seeping into his nose, his throat, until he could almost taste it. Outside, the mist was thickening, pressing up against the windows as if it were alive. Every so often he thought he saw movement in the fog, just faint impressions, as though figures wandered aimlessly at the edge of his vision. He shook it off, blaming his mind for playing tricks in the dim light. It was later, after he'd settled into bed, that the sounds began. It was faint at first, a soft rustling, like footsteps dragging through damp leaves. Tadashi lay still, his ears straining against the silence, but the sound faded just as he was beginning to focus on it. Then, a few minutes later, he heard it again. A low, scraping sound somewhere outside. It was slow, deliberate, as though someone were scratching something sharp along the wooden walls of the cabin. He wanted to dismiss it as a branch scraping in the wind, yet there was no wind. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with silence. Tadashi lay awake, heart pounding, until the scraping stopped. But as he drifted into a fitful sleep, a voice broke the quiet, a whisper, so faint it barely registered, slipping through the dark. "Do you seek the red paper or the blue?" He jolted awake, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. The voice was gone. The cabin was silent, save for the faint crackle of embers in the stove. He told himself it was only a dream. Exhaustion, he thought. He forced himself to close his eyes, trying to block out the images and sounds his mind conjured in the dark. The next morning he stepped outside, shaking off the remnants of his disturbed sleep. The air was fresher, but as he walked around the cabin, he noticed something strange. Etched into the wooden boards, just beneath one of the windows, were symbols, intricate, looping carvings that looked like no language he'd ever seen. They were weathered and faint, as if they had been there for centuries. A shiver ran down his spine, but he tried to dismiss it. Maybe his grandfather had carved them. The man had always been fascinated with ancient lore and mythology. The hours passed uneventfully, yet the symbols weighed on his mind, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. He spent the day in a daze, barely noticing the passage of time, until he realized the sun was setting once more, casting an eerie glow over the lake. He decided to stay up that night to prove to himself that nothing was wrong. He stoked the fire and sat in the old armchair, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders as he listened to the sounds of the cabin settling. But as midnight approached, the oppressive quiet returned, pressing against him like a weight. Tadashi's heart hammered as he approached, every instinct urging him to stay back. But some force beyond reason compelled him forward. He peered through the small window in the door, and his breath caught. Standing at the edge of the lake was a figure cloaked in deep red, its face obscured by shadows. The figure stood utterly still, its posture relaxed yet unnaturally rigid, as though held in place by some unseen force. Tadashi could not make out a face, only the cloak's rich color. which seemed to drink in the moonlight. Before he could move, the voice echoed again, a faint whisper that seemed to seep into his mind. "Do you seek the red paper or the blue?" Fear froze him in place, and he felt a strange compulsion to respond, though he knew neither choice was safe. He managed to tear himself away from the window, backing into the corner of the cabin, his breathing shallow as he tried to calm the terror clawing at his mind. As he cowered, he noticed something horrifying. His arm, exposed from the blanket, bore symbols, faintly etched into his skin, as if by an invisible hand. The markings matched those carved into the side of the cabin. His skin crawled with pain, a prickling sensation that grew into a sharp, stabbing burn. The scratching resumed, louder and more insistent. The door rattled, its hinges creaking under the strain, though he had bolted it tight. The air felt charged, heavy with an ancient, malevolent force, and the strange, sour scent returned, filling the cabin with its choking presence. Tadashi's vision blurred, his head swimming as the voice continued, repeating the choice, each word louder and more invasive. Symbols danced before his eyes, looping and twisting, pulling him toward the door, toward that terrible choice. In a surge of panic, he grabbed his grandfather's old knife from the counter, carving a hasty symbol over the markings on his skin, desperate to break whatever force was binding him. The pain was sharp and blinding, but the whispering ceased, replaced by a dreadful silence. Outside, the fog had thickened, obscuring the figure at the lake's edge. Tadashi stumbled back from the door, collapsing onto the floor as the darkness swallowed him whole. When he awoke, it was dawn. The cabin was still, the symbols on his skin faded, though a faint scar remained where he had carved. The door was shut, the air clear, yet a sense of wrongness lingered, deep and pervasive. He packed his belongings in haste, refusing to look back as he left the cabin. And though he never spoke of that night, he often found himself glancing over his shoulder, haunted by the memory of the cloaked figure and the whispered choice that followed him still, echoing faintly in his dreams. Some choices, he knew, could never truly be escaped. If you like this story, and for more dark stories, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. See ya!